What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Trank. Today I'm going to be showing how I make this beautiful jewelry box. This has been a long time in the works. I've since moved into a new workspace, and so I'm really excited to have it done. I think you're going to enjoy it, so let's go ahead and dive into the video. So I start this project off by breaking down the Peruvian walnut lumber here with the track saw. One thing that's interesting about the Peruvian walnut is it's much softer than American walnut, so it's actually really nice to work with. It also has a bit more of a reddish hue than just brown. Now before bringing it to the table saw, I like to clean up the edge with the hand plane just to get a dead straight edge. Then I can rip it to width and start getting it cross-cut and get the layout ready to get the carcass. So I'm going to be going for a grain match around the carcass here, so I'll be cutting in the order of side, back, side, as opposed to cutting two sides and then the back. And now with those cut out, I can start the layout for the dovetails. So I'm using the marking knife here just to transfer the thickness of the stock. And right here you can see that continuous grain around the edge. And I use a pair of dividers just to lay out the dovetails. This will ensure that you get nice symmetric dovetails, and it allows you to quickly adjust the size of your pins to be what you want that to be. And I use a small 3D printed 8:1 layout tool here just to lay out those dovetails. And then I can get to start cutting those out. There's a good amount of dovetails in this project, so I just get going with the saw and stay accurate. Now the saw you see me using here is the Rob Cosman dovetail saw. I've used this in some of my other videos, but I truly believe it's the best saw on the market. It's got a lot more weight, which allows you to cut plumb a lot easier and just maintain your cut. And here you can see we've got all the tails cut out. And before I take out the waste, I go ahead and use the offset method to mark for the corresponding pin cuts. And now I can get started on those pins, and again it's pretty much the same process as cutting the tails, just rinse and repeat. And once those are all cut, I can come through with the fret saw and take out the waste. You can see here I went for fairly narrow pins, certainly narrow enough that you know that the dovetails are hand cut, but they're not insanely narrow that they become very fragile. And then one of the more satisfying spots here is cutting out the waste on the tails, because it takes 2 seconds to cut them out and then it just pops right out. After cutting out the waste, I use a chisel and a mallet to carefully pare away to the shoulder line. Now it's crucial here that you come at it from both directions, only going about halfway through. This is going to ensure that you don't get tear out and go past your shoulder line on the opposite side. You can see here the way I like to do it is engage the cut vertically and then adjust to the angle of the dovetail as I start to sink into the wood further. Now before gluing up the dovetails, there's going to be a lapped dovetail on the front of this jewelry box, and that's going to be the top support piece. And so I decided to go ahead and cut the mortise out before the glue up. Normally you would probably cut the lapped dovetail and then use that to, mark out your mortise, but because I wanted to get this chiseled out before it was assembled to give it more leverage, I decided to go ahead and start with the mortise, which ended up being fine as long as you keep to your measurements and lay out everything very carefully. So I kind of just make some cuts there as if I was cutting half-ply dovetails, just go a little bit of the way through, and then I come through with the chisel to clean up to the layout lines. And you can see here you just want to remove material slowly, only taking about half material waste at a time. until you're within about 1 millimeter or less of your layout line, and then you can go right on that shoulder and pare it down. You can see after a bit of cleanup work, it's looking really clean. So here we've got the tails there and then the lapped dovetail mortises. And again, before assembly, we also have to take care of the sliding dovetails, which are going to house the dividers for the drawers, as well as the dado at the top, which is going to hold the top of the jewelry box tray, you could call it, and you can see here we've got a straight bit that we start with in order to just cut the dado to the maximum size that'll fit the sliding dovetail bit or the dovetail bit. And then you can come through with the dovetail bit so that it's just removing a minimal amount of material, which gives you a much cleaner look, a much cleaner finish. And here you can see those dovetails looking nice on the front. Now for the dado that's going to house that top panel, it has to be a stop dado so that you don't tear through those tails and see it on the outside. I don't like making plunge cuts on the router, but I set up a stop and just do it very carefully. And then I pre-finish the inside of the carcass before the glue up so that that's taken care of and I won't have to worry about accessing that later on. After pressing those in to get the joint started, I can just finish by malleting those in fully to seat them completely. And after letting that glue dry, I can come plane away the material and see how the dovetails turned out. You can see here they turned out beautiful with no gaps at all, and they were looking very good. So with those carcass done, I could start getting the dividers going, and for these it's again going to be the Peruvian walnut, and they're about 1/4 inch stock, slightly undersized from 1/4 inch stock, and then they're going to have a sliding dovetail on the side to go into those sliding dovetails we made on the carcass. So what you have to do here is just extremely carefully creep up on the correct fit because you don't want any gap coming through on the front. And so I just keep doing passes, adjusting the fence ever so slightly until they just slide into place. You can see here I did end up splitting it into 2 pieces per panel. That way, instead of leaving a gap at the back to allow for wood movement, the split just allows them to move towards the center. Now, this top panel was not going to be seen at all because I'm going to be using zebra wood as the secondary wood. But because this won't be seen, I just went ahead and used some soft maple here. This was a little leftover ambrosia maple. And I just used the shooting board and hand plane to get a perfect fit. And you can see that doing that allows you to get a perfect drop fit into the carcass. And on the underside of that tray, where you can see it just on the bottom edge, I put my emblem. It's a little hard to see here with the glare, but that just has my logo and initials. And with that, I can get started on that lapped dovetail support piece. And so now we've cut the mortises for that, and the next step is to cut the lapped dovetail itself. Now what I did is I just kept my sliding bevel gauge at the same angle it was for the rest of the layout, so that way I knew I was cutting the exact same angle. And I just used a caliper to measure in from each side what was the dimension according to my plans, and then I could carefully cut those out. You can see I used a chisel just to give me a slight shoulder there before I cut off the waist. That just allows you to make sure you don't dig past that shoulder line, and that would reveal a gap, of course. And I also put the dado in that piece to go into that front of the maple frame. And with a little bit of glue, that can get pressed and clamped into place to dry. Now I left this top piece a little bit proud, that way I could just plane it down to be perfectly flush as opposed to risking the chance of cutting the material, in which case I would have to add it back, which would be very difficult. So here I'm just preparing the material for the lid here, and I'm using a shaker rail and style bit to do frame and panel joinery for the lid. This will allow me to use a zebra wood panel and also take care of wood movement on that lid. So after cutting the actual grooves on the router table, I can then trim them to size at the crosscut sled and then plane them down on the inside edge before assembling it. This will be because it's going to be really hard to access these these little inner profiles once it's glued together. So I just get those nice and cleaned up beforehand. So here we can see a piece of zebra wood, and I'm just getting this milled down and planed so that I can go ahead and resaw this on my coworker's bandsaw and then glue it up into a panel. And to do that glue up, I just joint both edges at the same time. That allows you to get a perfect glue seam and you'll never see it. So here you can see it's been resawed and planed down to just under a 1/4 inch, and then I can cut that out. I got a mirror cut out so that on the inside of the lid, when you lift it up, there's going to be a mirror so that when you're applying the jewelry, you have a little way to see what you're doing. And I pre-finished that zebra wood panel and slid that into place with the mirror and got the lid glued up. Now it comes out mostly flat from the rayon style joinery, but you still want to clean up those joints and get those seams nice and perfect. And here you can see it dropped on top. You can start to see the overall look coming together. I think it's looking really good at this point. The next step is to shift attention to the drawers. Now I'll be using the Peruvian walnut again for the drawer sides and then zebra wood for the drawer bottoms. Now ideally I would have liked to dovetail the drawers together, but at this point I was running a bit low on time to get this project finished, and so I ended up going with miter joints for the drawers and used zebra wood for splines, and that gives you a nice accent, as you'll see later, on the front of the drawers, while still giving you an overall good joint and appearance. So to cut the miters, I start on the router table just with a 45-degree chamfer bit, and I start creeping up on that cut, but I don't actually finish them there. I finish them with a shooting board in the hand plane, and the reason is I found this to be bar none the most accurate way to cut mitered joints. It gets you a perfect 45 degrees and it avoids tear out that you'd get from the router table. So that's my preferred method for cutting mitered joints. And here I'm just carefully measuring for the panel and for the drawer front to make sure it's all sized correctly. And before assembling these drawers, I get rid of any of the hard edges with a block plane and just give them a slight chamfer. Now here's a little tip. I see a lot of people assembling mitered joints using tape, but they often use masking tape. My problem with that is that when you fold these together with masking tape, you can't actually see those joints to make sure that they completely closed. So if you just use some clear packing tape, it gives you ample enough strength for the clamping pressure, but it also allows you to see through to that joint and make any small adjustments to make sure they're closing up properly. So I found this to be a much better way to assemble mitered boxes. So there's two drawers, one larger one on the bottom and a slightly smaller one on top. And so I just get them both folded up and glued into place. And here you can see they have a pretty nice piston fit into the recess there, and you get a nice grain match on the front and a really clean look. Now in order to reinforce those miters, again I'll be using splines, and so I use my spline jig here on the table saw. I make sure to put in a flat ground blade so that I don't get any sort of non-flat bottoms from that cut. And then I can just use the pole saw to cut down some thin material for the splines. And I paid special attention to plane these down exactly to thickness so that they would go right into their spline cutouts without any gaps. And in order to help get them in, because they tend to swell when you get the wood glue on them, I just used a block here with a 45-degree cut on the back so I could use a clamp to really fully seat those splines. And then one of the more satisfying moments, of course, is flush cutting those splines. It's really fun to see those, kind of reveal once that waste comes off. I do use a piece of tape to support so that I don't dig into the wood itself at all, and I found that this does work really well. Even with the flush cut saw, they're still going to sit a little bit proud, so I carefully come through with a very sharp blade on the hand plane, because at this point you're planing a good amount of end grain, and those splines will want to split out if you don't have a very sharp blade. And with that done, I can start shifting my attention to the hinges for the lid. So I'm using Brusso hinges. They're solid brass, they're very well machined, and it's my preferred method for higher end boxes and furniture. Now I have a very particular way of laying out for these mortises, and Matt Eslia has a great video on how to do this. I highly recommend you check it out. But basically it entails breaking down those fibers with a series of chopping cuts and then carefully coming through and paring. And you want to work your way again to that shoulder line to make sure you don't blow past it. The key here is to just be patient and have a sharp set of chisels. And if you do this and you follow the correct layout, you're going to end up with a really good fit for the hinge. And you know it's a good fit when you're able to press the hinge into place and it'll sit there without any screws going in. Now I use an awl here to mark the hole for the screw pilot holes, and I put those pilot hole marks just slightly more towards the inside of the box. That means that when you put the actual screws in, it's going to pull that hinge closer to the wood fibers and not push it further back, revealing a gap. So that's something I recommend doing on all your hinge installations. You can then use the stainless steel screw provided by Brusso to pre-tap the pilot hole with the threads, because if you don't do this, you're going to probably tear out or strip your little brass threads because they are very soft, and I also use some wax to put them in to make sure this doesn't happen. Then I can just do a little bit more cleanup on the lid and get that screwed into place, and here you can see it fits perfectly. It's flushed up with the rest of the box and has a nice shadow line reveal that's even around the entire perimeter. Next, I can start thinking about the drawer pulls. I decided to make the pulls out of zebra wood as opposed to buying some stock pulls. I thought it would just be a nice touch, and I went over a couple different designs until I got one I liked, and I ended up cutting out a couple different sizes of those pulls just to make sure that I got one that looked good. It involves a few cuts at the table saw, a few profiles at the miter saw, at the grouter table with a chamfer bit, and then again finishing it up at the table saw just to get those sides a nice little taper as well. Now here you can see there's a little tear out there at the edge of those pulls, and I just use it by pulling it against my block plane just to clean it up and get rid of any tear out. And then I can carefully start the layout for these small dowel pins that are going to connect it to the box. And it's little details like these that, unless you made the box and looked closely at it, you probably wouldn't notice, but it's also what sets it apart from a lot of the generic work that's out there. So here you can see there's 3 little maple dowels that are being used to attach that pull to the front of the drawer. And after those have set into place, I can just carefully cut those flush. Now the inside has finish on it, so I have to be really careful at this point. And you can see there's a nice little contrast between those dowels and the inside. Now in order to access the lid itself, I'm doing a nice elegant little finger pull using this technique I saw by Rob Cosman, just using a drum sander bit on the drill press, and it gives you a really nice little finger groove that's very low profile but very functional. And after that, I could get into the extensive sanding process to make sure everything is looking perfect. And so I worked my way up to 600 grit sandpaper because I'm using Odie's-Oil as a finish, and unlike a polyurethane where you need a coarser surface in order to get acceptable bonding of the finish. With Odie's oil, you can sand to a pretty high grit and still get a fine bond. So here you can really start to see that joinery pop as the Odie's oil goes on and as you get the contrast between the long grain and the end grain. Same goes for the dovetails on the outside. And with the overall outside of the jewelry box finish, I could get working on the inserts to hold the jewelry itself. Now, the client that this is for has a lot of necklaces in particular, and so these slots are targeted for holding necklaces, and I used my friend's CNC to cut these slots out, which was a huge help, so thanks to Lucas for that. And then once those were done on the CNC, I could work on getting them cut to size. I'm also using a small piece of felt insert here that's made to hold rings and earrings. And then it's just a matter of planing things until you get the perfect piston fit. So the bottom drawer will get this felt piece for the rings and earrings, as well as a small compartment for just various pieces of jewelry. The top drawer and the top lid panel will have spots for the necklaces. Now, in order to give it a nice felt bottom, I'm using a cardinal red flocking compound, and I really enjoy doing this. It's really simple to do and gives you a very excellent professional finish. One thing I've learned is to be very generous with the amount of fibers that I shoot on, because if you leave any spots lacking with fibers, it's going to come through as a shiny spot in the adhesive, so you're better off just shooting more on than you need and collecting the leftover afterwards. And then I can pull back the tape, which kept the top of it clean, and you can see there's a little bit that spills out, which is easily taken care of with sanding, but overall it has a great finish. Now, to customize and add some personalization to the jewelry box, I'm actually doing a small brass plate inlay that has the client's name and the year, so that way hopefully many generations on they remember what year this was made in. And I use a small 3D printed template in order to cut the mortise for this. And then I can put that piece of brass in with a little bit of CA glue, and off camera I also buff that and get the polish nice and shiny. With that in, I could apply the Odie's oil to the dividers here, or to the inserts, and I also, at this time, I went ahead and put a second coat of the Odie's oil on the rest of the jewelry box, specifically of the exterior, just to make sure it has a nice durable finish. And finally, I could buff it clean. I'm extremely happy with how this turned out. I think it's one of the nicest things I've made. So if you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe, guys. I have more videos coming. But thanks for watching, and enjoy the final shots of this jewelry box.